Welcome back to the Queer Circle, where queer healers step up to the mic to share their stories and what they would tell their younger self. Today's guest is Roman Reimer, a queer, trans, non-binary, White Ashkenazi Jew. He has a bachelor's in liberal arts with a background in theater training at various improv schools. While Roman does have a history of working as a caregiver to trans and queer clients, as well as a member of SAG-AFTRA, currently Roman resides in the San Francisco Bay Area, working as a standardized patient, radio show host, and trained theta healer. Welcome to the Queer Circle, Roman.
I only knew one of my grandparents, and three of the four immigrated from Eastern Europe. And my maternal grandfather left to Poland in his early 20s, and he lost his brothers and his parents in pogroms. And I feel like a lot of his depression and anxiety and distrust of the world kind of came through, even though I didn't get a chance to know him or meet him. I felt I've inherited some of those qualities in a way. And on my father's side, there were folks who fought in the Russian Revolution. And recognizing from what I've heard, again, these are folks who I didn't know, but hearing from what he has shared with me about them, the idea of people feeling like they had nothing left to lose. And that's what brought them to, I guess, show up. And then there's another story. This is just like from my ancestors. And again, I think for some, from some Ashkenazi folks, not necessarily knowing our heritage back to a certain point, all we can really know about is just going back a couple generations, is that there's another one on my mother's side who, I believe her great uncle, who refused to fight. And in doing so, he cut off his thumb because he didn't believe in fighting. And I think about how that shows up in me in a way, and living in this country, which is a very militaristic country, to say the least, and how it has celebrated militarization and still does, and how that feels, I think, for some of us who just don't operate that way, and what that means in terms of questioning what we're told, and how there's been just so much anti-leftist sentiment in this country. So thinking about that. And I also think about how anxiety and trauma is passed on through generations. And since my parents were first generation to be born in the US, I'm grateful that my grandparents were able to escape the violence and fascism in Eastern Europe. I do have, very harsh feelings about the US and its history and what's still going on here and has been for hundreds of years. And I think just growing up here, there's just so much learning and unlearning to do based on what was taught or not taught in schools, how it was taught, as well as through the media. And there's so many other messages that I am still beginning to and continuing to just to question and to push back against, and so much internalized homophobia and transphobia and so many messages that were so hurtful. And it's difficult to, I think, find as I'm approaching 40, finding these behaviors in myself and patterns in myself, and wanting to undo some of these damaging behaviors, I guess. And I think it's easy to maybe see in other people and to call out or call in for other people. And I think harder to do for ourselves and for myself. And I feel like that's what part of the work has been for me as well. I mean, every family is complex, certainly, and I feel grateful for the family I was brought into, in that it wasn't, when I came out as gay in high school in the mid to late 90s, it wasn't an issue. And going back to internalized homophobia, certainly, even though my parents were accepting of that, and we had they were not very religious, but went to synagogue, and there weren't any that I could tell outright homophobic instances there. I think and even though I grew up in or outside large cities, there still was so much internalized homophobia based on growing up in the 80s and watching TV and movies and certain books we were told to read in school and billboards and advertising. And there's so much that I remember being unhappy that I realized I liked women, which is ridiculous. I mean, if folks meet me now and they view me, I identify as non-binary, though people perceive me as being male. It's just, if I say it out loud and someone who might meet me for the first time and might not know my history, they'd be like, wow, that was weird that you felt weird for being attracted to women. And it's that thing, I think transitioning or finding that part of my identity was this whole, first of all, it was just questioning everything I've been told, as well as I didn't get out of one box to be put into another. And it's so complex and it's hard to find the language for it. I think partially just because language is also constantly evolving, and some of the language that we've used years ago is no longer relevant or acceptable in some cases, and it constantly is evolving. So I think that part of it's just that. And also, I feel like my identity is fluid in a way, both with gender identity and sexuality, which of course are different. So who I am today, thankfully, won't be the same person I am tomorrow and wasn't in the past. And I want to continue to evolve. And it's also just difficult when I look back, and my perspective on it now, I'm sure, is different than it was a year ago, 2 years ago. And I think that's also what makes it difficult for me on a personal level, is that main part of it's wanting to be careful with my words, and also just recognizing that ideally we should live in a world where everyone's allowed to and open to constantly explore how we identify ourselves and how we view ourselves. And instead it's like, I feel like identity can feel very rigid at times with how we present ourselves. As far as identifying as trans, like I've been an avid journaler throughout my life, and I found journals which I hadn't really looked at for years that I'd written maybe when I was like 19 years old, and I found them maybe a couple years ago when I was in my late 30s. And in them, I'm writing that I'm drunk, I identify as a man, and I didn't do anything, let alone tell anyone about it for the most part until my late 20s. So I think there's a sense that a lot of us who are queer, we know ourselves better than anyone else, clearly, yet we don't live in a world that really either welcomes us or even lets us know that we can exist. And I think for me as a trans man, that part of it was just that my only acknowledgement was of Boys Don't Cry, which of course he's played by a cis woman and is misgendered, and it's based on a true story. He ends up being, I should provide a trigger warning, but just he's raped and killed by friends of his. So I think for myself and other trans men I've talked to, that really finally having this identification for who we are, we finally have this, and then here's a story about how we can't even exist in the world. And that probably, I'm sure, had some element of making it harder for me. And so I think that was part of it, and also just not knowing how to address it. And then when I started doing stand-up a couple of years later, after that, I had a joke about how I identify as a man. A joke. You can't see me because this is audio, but I'm doing quotation marks. I had a joke about how I identified as a man, blah, blah, blah. And doing stand-up was one way of me actually expressing myself, where I didn't have to play by anyone else's rules in a way, and I could use the language I wanted to describe myself. However, it feels like a lot talking about, because it was just very difficult, and there were people in my life who did not take it well. And I won't get into it too much, but that also, I think everyone in the world wants to feel seen and heard for who they are. And when you're not, it can feel very difficult. And it's like, we're taught not to trust ourselves and our own voices. And I think that starts with children too. And when a lot of folks end up gendering their children even before they're born, even before people enter into the world, folks have these expectations as to how they will identify. And that's extremely dangerous. And then we spend the rest of our lives having to fight back against it to just acknowledge, just to say who we are. And that's the basic thing, saying who you are, let alone wanting to exist in this world, which it's just so heartbreaking that, again, the world does not feel open and accepting for people just to be who they are, at the very least, to simply exist in this world. And I find that to be just heartbreaking. As an adult, now I can recognize, obviously, clearly, I still have, work to do on myself. And also, as an adult, at least, I can recognize how problematic and wrong and how much brainwashing there was in so many ways. There still is. However, as an adult, I at least have that understanding of, especially if someone in a position of power is being a complete fucking asshole, or is wrong, or is lying, or is spreading harmful propaganda. As an adult, I can identify that and say, oh, this person is wrong. And I think as a child, it's really difficult because either you don't have the agency, or if you do, people might not believe you, or a whole other number of reasons. Your brain is still developing. And it's so, as a kid who was brought up in the 80s, which was full, I look back and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's so, how many families were just decimated by the Reagan administration, and how many children were brought up without being connected to their families, and just through mass incarceration and the HIV and AIDS crisis and the wars abroad, and just and just lack of resources for mental health, and to just say no to, I could go on and on. It just seems like a fucking mess. And as a kid, it was I've got nothing else to compare that to. So I didn't really have the ability to question what was going on, or question what was being told to me. And so I think part of it's also just recognizing generationally, and not that hasn't, clearly that's still going on and has been going on in different ways and was going on before I was born. However, I think each generation's, there's specifics as to who's in position of power and how it's handled, and what the media shows us. And maybe I'm just talking a bit broad, but I think it's, I just have a lot of compassion for children and for young people, where if you don't have an opportunity to really understand the harm that's being done in terms of, and also just I'm kind of going all over the map here, but lack of arts funding and things I wish when I was growing up that I'd had more either role models or mentors or other adults in my life, other people to show me. I know my parents did the best they could. And also I think for all kids to have as many different people and points of view in their life, because there's so many ways to be. And unfortunately with TV and movies, it was a very kind of white, very cisgender, very heteronormative, as far as to see people, this idea of who to emulate, or what the standards of beauty are, for instance. It's so limiting, and that's so harmful. There's so much to undo. One of the first openly trans men I met, Tom, really, who's a friend of a friend, and I'm grateful I was able to openly mention it in conversation. I was considering transitioning, or I guess I was mentioning it enough where someone was able to pick up on it, and my friend Julie was able to refer me to someone who was openly trans, and that just opened me up entirely to oh, this is a possibility as to how I can exist. And through this person, Tom, I was able to understand what next steps could be for how I was going to pursue this. And also just introducing me to other people as well, because we all have our own stories and everyone's experience is unique. And it's, every person has their own story. And just through people I've met, my world really did open up because of that, and because of the folks that I met. As a kid, I was really sensitive, and I cried all the time. Every day at school, in elementary school, I think I cried. And it was seen as not okay, that there was something that was wrong with me. And I don't know how much that had to do with gender identity or just being sensitive or feeling like something was wrong and not being able to quite articulate what that was. And it's just the way things are just feels so unnatural to just so counterproductive to being honest and to being human and to expressing emotion. And I just have a lot of empathy for kids and for my younger self. And for a while, I did not like kids, I think, because I had issues with myself and frustration that I wasn't someone else, someone who could deal better or wasn't upset about what I thought were small things. And now that I have more of an understanding of just how the world works and how unjust it is and how unfair it is, and it doesn't need to be this way. It's not that life isn't fair because of some other odd reason. Like, no, there are people in positions of power who deliberately cause harm. I think it was when I was in between housing for a number of years, both in New York and here in the Bay Area, where I grew up. And I just learned to really just rely on other people. And so people showed up in so many ways. And so often it was the folks with the least who offered the most. And I just met so many different people who let me stay on their floors, on their couches, pet sit, house sit for them. And that really kept me afloat in a way that I think I was brought up, middle class and with a certain number of privileges. And it wasn't until I really wasn't employed at the time and didn't have stable housing that I realized just how I have more of a personal understanding of class, which up until then I had, I think, an understanding and a sympathy for, but I didn't quite fully comprehend it. And I also just recognize how people viewing me and like through my body and being viewed as white and male, and how that has provided certain safety and access to spaces throughout that difficult time too, I recognized, and how I can walk down the street without feeling a sense of fear that many other folks have. And it really, and if anything, I mean, it just makes me so angry because clearly, like, I felt I've been targeted for transphobia in my life, and also it's a very precarious thing as a trans man, because one does gain, or not one, I can only speak for myself, where I've gained the privilege of being viewed as male, so there's that safety connected to that. And at the same time, how I present my maleness, for instance, I don't even know how to comment on it, but I recognize the difference between how I was perceived as female versus now, and being able to recognize that and how that can expand to just how ridiculous it is, because clearly, like, my soul is the same. I'm the same, whatever's in me. I don't know how people necessarily want to describe it, but what we feel inside ourselves, and like our body, I'm connected to my body, and also it's this case that I'm in. It's how I travel the world, and it's separate from me in a way. And the fact that how I've also just learned to question, like, how am I viewing someone else based on their appearance, and what am I bringing to that, and what preconceived notions and feelings. Instead of solving a lot of or answering questions, I feel like I've just begun to ask more questions, continuing to ask more questions, and to understand why do I do what I do. Is that to continue to ask questions, and curiosity is something that I think should be fostered, and to ask why, instead of simply accepting what's been told to us. And I also just wanted to say I'm grateful for folks who have taught me different ways to interact with the world and different ways to support myself too, because there's just so many different ways to be. And I guess it goes again back to being brought up in the 80s, where there was just this very limited way, and I'm sure still today too, like this limited way of living, how to live and what to do and who to be. And there are so many different ways that folks can show up in the world. And I feel like the more we can recognize that, the better off we'll be. don't know when I ever have not struggled with depression in a way. Certainly there are elements in my life to cope with it that have helped, as well as struggling with anxiety as well. And I feel if one looks at the world as it is, I don't know how anyone could not feel angry or upset or have depression, because it's just so fucked up. There's no other way to put it. Like, I don't understand how you can have empathy for other people and not just recognize how at times just disgusting and unfair and backwards the world is, and how the systems that are in place that don't allow for people to even exist. Like the fact that there are people who don't, like, it should be the idea that like people should have access to healthcare and housing and food and education, like, and families should be together who want to be together. Like it's just preposterous. And instead of those views, which I believe many of us have, being normalized, instead it's like, oh, well, I guess I just can't quote unquote function, so I better, and I've been on antidepressants on and off for years, and they've definitely helped me. And also there's that part of me that feels so frustrated that I recognize the roots of what make me depressed and angry are the fact that we live in such an unjust world where people aren't just allowed to be. And people in positions of power, I keep on coming back to that, are not held accountable. There were friends I lost. I mean, I guess there weren't, what's that saying? Like, if they weren't there to support you, they weren't your friends all along. So there was that, like, more maybe acquaintances of folks who I knew, or former coworkers who just stopped talking to me. And there are some people in my life who had a really difficult time accepting me as trans and with my new name. And thankfully, a lot of the folks who did have difficulty, my parents, for instance, had a really tough time with it for years. And thankfully now we're at a place where they call me Roman and they use male pronouns. And the healing aspect of that has been so wonderful. And I feel very fortunate for that. And it's a good reminder that there are folks, people can change. People have to want to change, and people can. So that's something that's been helpful. And as far as like a loss or death of some sort, there is that. I had a strong connection to my old name. It was a cool name. It just didn't suit me, and I miss it. And I went around, about choosing my new name, I feel like fairly quickly, because I just can be indecisive at times. And it's like, all right, let me just, all right, I tried out a few ones, and I'm like, all right, I got to just pick something and go with it. Legally, it took me a while to get that changed, but I miss my old name. There are certain things and I've heard many other trans men talk about how being like feeling a part of, I guess, lesbian, for lack of a better word, culture, and feeling not quite as part of that anymore necessarily. And I understand, like, I don't identify as such. And also that was part of a community that I identified with. Like, it's more like the identification with people that I no longer, and maybe I do when I meet people. It's different in terms of, okay, here's a good example. Walking down the street, if I see two women together as a couple, and I no longer have that sense of, oh, I'm one of you, or like I can smile, but if I smile and they see me and they don't know me, it might be like, who's that creepy guy smiling at us? Like, I don't want to pass that along in any way. And so I think there is that sense of feeling invisible in a different way, perhaps. And I do miss that, as well as toxic masculinity is fucking awful. And there's this idea that men need to be a certain way and are shamed for being what are considered feminine traits or like anything like that. And while I wasn't brought up internalizing some of those things for myself, there still is that, like, initially I noticed myself wanting to have I'm an actor, so I can definitely put on a deeper voice, and I can maybe hold my body in a certain way that might perceive being less feminine. And I have tried to push away from that. Like, I don't want to regurgitate what other people's idea of a man should be. Also, the idea of being masculine presenting means that there's a shift in how society would view my interaction with kids. So I think that's also something that I miss, where as being viewed as a woman with, like, there's still these very just, I think, sexist ideas that somehow, like, men can't be responsible around kids or something, or that, like, just feels different. I don't know how to quite phrase it exactly, but it just feels like it's a loss of some sort. So just, I think all in all, it's learning how to deal with other people's perceptions of me and what they projected onto me and how to make peace with that. At first, I think for a lot of trans folks, survival is the first thing, like just being able to exist in the world. And then once, for me, I can only speak for myself, once I was able to kind of establish myself and who I was, then one begins to recognize all the social cues and so much else of that. And I think part of it is that going through so much and fighting so hard to be seen, it makes me less willing to settle for what other people say or view. And it's more, I consider myself to be a kind of a shy person. And at the same time, I think in order to present myself as I am, and for a lot of folks to show up as they are, that requires a lot of strength and a lot of bravery and a lot of also just refusing to follow the status quo in a really problematic way. When you have folks who are close to you who don't see you as you are, one really has to find, I had to find my own voice, and I had to really believe in myself in a way. I think part of those lessons stick. I didn't, once you get out of a certain way of being, it's hard to go back to the way of like, oh, I'm going to wait for someone else. I wasn't about to let someone else tell me how I could be. And also I was able to see how other things that cis men with best of intentions told me how to be, like I couldn't cross my legs, I couldn't do X, Y, and Z, like little things that they thought men could or could not do. And I was like, why do you say that? And really recognizing how we're all, every single person, cis, trans, non-binary, folks all across the spectrum are kind of programmed to be a certain way. And it's not just us trans folks who are told, who are limited by preconceived notions of gender. So I came to find peace and acceptance with myself through performing. I was still doing improv and stand-up comedy around the time I transitioned. And actually improv really kind of helped me with that, because in a way it was, I know some folks don't like that it can be viewed as drama therapy. However, I feel like part of it can be. And I think in some way for me it was, in that every day I was able, or not every day, but when I was on stage, I was able to play a different character. I was able to present myself in a different way. And I noticed I was constantly playing male characters, like all the time. And I think part of that realization of being able to be seen, it allowed me the freedom to experiment and the way just to be seen as who I was. And at the time, I felt like I had a community where people could support me. And at the time, I also was single, so I didn't have a partner. And having other folks around to help me through was really helpful. And through storytelling, and I did a few solo shows, or however you want to call them, shows, I guess, because people did help me out with directing. And anyway, they were being able to help maybe other people come out too. Like folks would come see the show, and then I'd hear someone else had been like, oh, this person who came to their show is a friend of mine, and now they feel comfortable coming out. And that felt so amazing. And it's that reminder of like, oh, I can be visible, and me being visible in this instance will help others. And I also do feel like storytelling is such a beautiful and important and necessary act, because it helps folks empathize with one another, and just to recognize, to tell from one person's perspective. It can help communicate ideas, and also finding the universal themes too. When one talks about fear and what one has been through, it helps people relate to each other. So it was, I think, just as healing for me as it was for maybe folks in the audience. I was able to finally tell my story and be like, this is what I was struggling with for, at that point, 27 years of my life. And to be able to have people finally listen and see me was just so powerful. Meeting other trans folks too throughout, like I'm still like really excited when that happens, like just to meet other folks, because there is, yes, every person has their own challenges, and also there is something in common that we all have. And in a sense, there can be like this kind of shorthand in terms of communicating, where we've kind of experienced something very, very similar, and it feels very validating to see other and connect with other trans folks. Giving attention to people, just listening to people is such a big thing. People want to be heard, people want to be seen, and offering compassion and validation. And as I've been mentioning throughout, just it feels very easy for myself to feel like the world doesn't quite reflect, the outside world doesn't reflect all that we could be, all the best that humanity has to offer. And that can feel like very, I've had therapists. Oh, I had one therapist who did not see me very, and she kind of pathologized my political stance. And that was so invalidating. And I think to recognize other people's fears and feelings about the world is so necessary. And that's what I hope to do, not necessarily as a podcast host or as a theta healer or as an actor, but more even as a person in my daily life, like regardless of what situation I'm in. It's something I aspire to, is I want to be able to meet people where they're at and acknowledge who they are and where they are. And there's a saying that we remember how people made us feel and not so much what they did. And so I remember the first time that someone used my chosen name, and the first time someone used masculine pronouns with me. And it's honestly, it's like the bare minimum just to treat people how they want to be treated. And at the same time, it's kind of rare. It's really rare, I think. And if everyone was given the respect and the attention and the love that they deserved, we'd live in a much different world. And instead, it's still, not to go back down, but behavior is met with punishment. And if we could meet that with compassion and understanding and asking questions instead of, punishment doesn't solve anything. I think of when in my life I have hurt people the most, and if I can, now that I'm in a place in my life where I feel a little bit more secure, I know that's kind of a difficult term to use, but just in terms of I'm in a place now where I can kind of look back on my behavior towards folks in my life in the past, and when I was the most feeling the most vulnerable or not seen or not respected, that's when I think I lashed out the most, or when I didn't have stable housing. And there's certain pieces in my life parts in my life when I just did not, I think, respect myself, and I kind of hurt others because of that. So I think when I think about like my younger self, I'm trying to have compassion for my younger self, and not, like, I do have regrets, and also wish I had acted or said things differently, and also recognize the circumstances which caused me to act that way. And like, I still want to take responsibility, and at the same time acknowledge that we don't live in a society that really encourages folks to be vulnerable or talk about their emotions. And things are so backwards in the United States, for instance, where poverty is criminalized and militarism is celebrated and punishment is celebrated, and more money goes into funding the military and police than education. And everything is connected, and it feels really insurmountable. And at the same time, I have learned to begin to understand my role in that and what I can do to not partake in any of the harm that capitalism encourages us to partake in, where we have to put someone else down in order to get ahead. And how does one live outside of that and create a new way of being? as far as what I would tell my child self with what I know today, I don't know, because there's that idea of like, I don't want to like, if I change the past, then I'd be different now. And had I known anything differently then, who would I be now? That's a whole other conversation. But to trust my gut, to have compassion for myself, like I still do suffer from like low self-esteem at times, like at times, definitely, and self-doubt. I still question myself with a lot of self-doubt and lack of confidence in a lot of areas of my life. And as a kid, even more so. And as a kid, I was even more shy and more afraid and more timid in a lot of areas. And again, I don't know how much of that goes back to epigenetics, where my grandfather was a Holocaust survivor and, bringing in like, of course, like, was attacked when he was a kid and lost his family. So of course it makes sense that those are traits that I might inherit unbeknownst to me. And seeing how that plays out, I would say to question everything, question what adults say, because quite often adults don't know what they're talking about and are still figuring things out. Do not be afraid to question and hold accountable countries that harm people, including the US and including Israel, as well as recognizing privileges in being a white Ashkenazi Jew and how white supremacy does exist within Judaism and how to eradicate that and show up for Jews of color. And simply because a community has been harmed, that's not an excuse to further cause that harm to other people, not to repeat that behavior. And to really to trust your gut and have a critical eye of what you especially see on TV and in movies and through the media. And I think a lot of the way that people are portrayed in the media is in a really negative, limiting way through a lens that's not accurate and can cause a lot of pain. So to seek people out, I guess, and to be curious about the world, and to also be curious about the land that you're on, not just in terms of learning about nature, but the real history of the land that you're on and where you go and who you speak with, and to keep an open mind and have a reminder that everyone has something that you can teach them, and vice versa. In a way, we all can learn from each other, and to understand that. And as a kid who grew up in the 80s, fuck Ronald Reagan and fuck anyone who defends him. And there will be plenty of people in positions of power who cause great harm to the world and the planet. And it's important to speak truth to power and to question them. And just because someone is in a position of power doesn't mean that they know better or know best or are even behaving in a helpful way. And I would say it's also okay to show emotions, and there's nothing wrong with showing emotions. It's perfectly healthy, and in some ways the world would be a much more kind place if folks felt like they could show all of their emotions. Someone will love you for who you are, and you don't need to change yourself to please other people or to fit in. I've learned to become more patient the older I've gotten too, like still can work on it, but also just to not take things as personally. We see each other as we are, not as they are. And so recognizing, like at the same time wanting to take responsibility for my actions, at the same time also recognizing if someone else might just be having a really bad day and it might not have anything to do with me. And that's like, I think only for certain situations, like maybe more like minute situations, but not wanting to excuse really harmful behavior. At the same time, just kind of, I guess, deciding how to pick my fights, I guess, or what fights to pick. So I think that's what I would tell my younger self, and I'd give my younger self a big hug. Although that would be really weird to think about it, because I'd be like, who's this adult? And also, if I wasn't quite aware that I was trans, like, who's this man? And like, why is he hugging me? So that might be weird. But I would just want to just give them love. And then also just to not take things personally, and also to admit when I was wrong. I think that goes through, when I think about like as a child, initially it was like, okay, me elementary school age, like younger than 10. And then I think about the younger me all the way up till a minute ago, which is still younger. And like, I would like to think that I'm constantly evolving, and I would like to continue to be better and improve in so many ways that I could treat myself and I treat others, and to take responsibility for my actions, to tell the truth, to allow myself to be vulnerable, I think. And if folks ask, are you okay? There are times when I just didn't say, no, I'm not okay, or this is what I need, and to ask for help, which I still have a lot of trouble with, honestly. And I think even more so as a kid, to ask for help when I needed help, and to assert my needs. And again, this is so much easier for me to say than it is to do. However, I think quite often many of us are not raised to speak for ourselves, and still there's that need to like, oh, I want to please other people. I want to make sure other people are okay instead of making sure I'm okay. And so finding that balance where it is important to take care of oneself and to make sure my own needs are met, because then I can also help others more. Believe that a better world is possible, and the world that we experience and live in right now could be a lot better. And there are a lot of other people in the world who believe that too. And there are a lot of folks who have come before who have strived to make the world a better place. I'm so grateful for the folks I will never know who came before, I think, who did so much to get us to the place. Like, yes, things are really difficult right now in a lot of ways for a lot of reasons. And also things are also not as bad as they could be due to the people giving their lives for the freedom of everyone. And I wanted to like honor that as well for the folks who are not here with us right now, yet still, and like people in my life who I've lost who helped me survive. And I am like eternally grateful for that.
Thank you, Roman, for sharing your journey with us. Thank you, listener, for being with us today as well. If you'd like to learn more about Roman's work, you can check out his website for his weekly podcast, weeklyrev.wordpress.com, or livebio.com/Roman Reimer. You can find all this information and more on our website, queercirclepodcast.com. Music from today's episode was provided by Purple Fluorite. You can find Purple Fluorite's other works anywhere streaming is available, Spotify, iTunes, and beyond.